The year was 1879, and the noon sun over Cinder Creek, Wyoming, fell like judgment. Dust hung in the air so thick it turned the light the color of bone. A line of women stood on the platform beside the westbound stage, dresses faded, faces drawn tight against the stairs. Their names were read aloud by the matchmaker, her voice dry as corn husk. Men lifted their hands, traded glances, measured worth in silence. When the name June Whitlow was called, no hand rose. Someone laughed, sharp, bright, and quick to die in the heat. The sound burned more than the sun. June didn't flinch, though her fingers worried the edge of her worn gloves. She had stood on other platforms before, had heard that same pause, long, cruel, and certain. Every woman there carried some reason for being unwanted. Hers just happened to follow her from town to town. She kept her chin lifted, because lowering it would feel like saying they were right. From down the road came the sound of hooves, steady, deliberate. The crowd turned. A man on a dark bay rode in slow, the dust curling around him like smoke. His hat brim shadowed his face, but his skin caught the light, deep and burnished. A few whispers cut through the air. The black rancher from Twin Cotton. He swung down, boots hitting the dirt with a quiet thud, and tied his horse without hurry. Caleb Reddick had the stillness of someone who didn't need to prove he belonged, though everyone watching thought otherwise. His coat was sun-faded, his eyes pale as winter water. "I heard I'm late," he said, voice low, even. Mrs. Kincaid, the matchmaker, blinked. "Only one name left, Mr. Reddick." He nodded once. "Then I'll meet her." June felt the heat crawl up her neck. Men shifted, amused. Someone muttered, "Figures." Another chuckled, "Guess she'll take what she can get." Caleb walked the line, boots whispering over the planks, until he stopped in front of her. The sun caught the silver at his temples. He took off his hat. "Miss Whitlow." Her name and his voice sounded steadier than she felt. He held out his hand, not command, not pity, just an offering. The hush that followed was heavy, enough to hear her heartbeat in it. For a breath, she thought of refusing. Then she thought of how refusal had never protected her before. June set her hand in his. His palm was rough, warm, real. They sat on the bench at the far end of the platform, where the shade thinned and flies circled slow. A girl named Ellie Boone, barely 16, sat nearby as chaperone, pretending to read her small Bible. Caleb spoke first. "I run cattle south of the Cotton Creek line. I need help more than company. Somebody who knows how to plan, to keep order when I'm gone riding fence." "That's what you offer?" she asked. "That's what I can promise." He studied her the way men study the horizon, looking for weather, not beauty. June met his eyes, cautious. "And if I'm not what you hoped, then I'll learn different." There was no charm in his words, only a kind of quiet honesty that felt heavier than flattery. The crowd had already drifted off, losing interest, but June still felt their laughter lingering on her skin like dust that wouldn't wash off. She wanted to ask, why me? But the question caught in her throat. Caleb seemed to hear it anyway. Because you stood still when everyone else turned away, he said. A person who can stand still's worth something out here. The train whistle sounded, long and distant, rolling across the flats. The sun bent lower, glancing off the rails like a blade. For a heartbeat, the memory of rain flickered. Another platform, another town, a hand she hadn't taken, a night she'd run until her boots filled with mud. She pushed it down, smoothed her skirt, met his gaze. Tomorrow then, he said, rising. Tomorrow? Day starts early on the range. I'll call it 9. He tipped his hat and turned, the crowd parting without a word. When he mounted up, someone near the freight shed whispered, "Let's see how long he lasts." June didn't look their way. She watched the rider fade into the sun glare until horse and man became a single moving shape of gold and dust. She didn't know it yet, but that was the moment her life stopped shrinking. The wind shifted. A scrap of red fabric blew from somewhere down the platform and tangled briefly around her boot before the dust took it again. She bent to pick it up, then stopped, hand hovering in the air. The train hissed, ready to leave. She let the cloth go. The house sat at the edge of Cinder Creek like a leftover thought. Half boarding house, half refuge. Evening light pressed through lace curtains, painting everything in gold dust. June Whitlow stood by the small window of her rented room, hands still gloved though the air was warm. The sound of the town drifted faintly up the hill. Boots, laughter, a fiddle somewhere playing off-key. Mrs. Hattie Boone had given her tea and a soft warning. Men talk fast out here. Don't mistake the silence between their words for kindness. June smiled politely and said nothing. She unpacked what little she owned, a folded calico dress, a tin hairbrush, a letter she never read anymore. The handwriting on the envelope had faded to a ghost, but she couldn't make herself throw it away. She placed it under her pillow, the way people do with something that once mattered, but shouldn't anymore. From the window she could see the last of the sun sliding behind the ridge. The rails glimmered like a scar across the plain. The bench at the depot was empty now, except for a tumbleweed caught in the slats. She wondered if he, Caleb Reddick, had meant what he said about tomorrow at 9. The idea of someone keeping his word still felt foreign. She poured herself a little tea, watched the steam twist, thought about the red scrap that had brushed her boot. Maybe it had been nothing, a torn scarf, a signal flag, but it lingered in her mind like a whisper she almost recognized. She set the cup down, touched the small bruise of heat the sun had left on her wrist, and tried to rest. Sleep wouldn't come. The town was too new, too watchful. The mattress sighed under her weight like an old body remembering work. She turned on her side, staring at the wallpaper, tracing its faded roses until they blurred into nothing. Her thoughts slipped backward. Rain on a tin roof, a man's shout, the smell of whiskey and fear. She saw herself in a doorway, hair wet, palms bleeding where she'd fallen. Someone had grabbed her arm hard enough to bruise, and she'd run again. leaving behind a ring, a name, a part of herself she never took back. It had been years, but the sound of boots on wet wood could still turn her stomach cold. A knock at the door pulled her back. "Miss Whitlow?" It was Ellie, Boone, Hattie's daughter, voice bright with youth. "Ma says you forgot your key." June opened the door. The girl's cheeks were pink from climbing the stairs. In her hands was a small bundle wrapped in muslin. "Something left at the desk," Ellie said. "Mr. Reddick brought it by." June took the parcel. Inside was a folded sheet of paper and a tiny, square-cut piece of brown leather, old, polished smooth by years of use. The note read, in a spare hand, "For tomorrow. It keeps its word when clocks do not." She turned the leather piece over. It was a watch fob, plain except for a faint engraving, 2 cottonwood leaves crossing each other. The design was worn almost away. Still, the shape of it caught something in her chest, a memory of standing under those same trees that morning, listening to his voice. "Thank you, Ellie." The girl lingered, curious. "Is he nice?" June hesitated. "He's different." Ellie grinned. "Difference sometimes the only kind worth meeting." Then she bounced away, braid swinging, leaving the hallway full of her small footsteps. June sat on the edge of the bed. The letter under her pillow felt heavier now, as if it knew it might soon be replaced by something real. She looked at the watch fob again, its surface catching what little light was left. Outside, the last train whistled through, long and lonely, pulling the day behind it. She laid the leather piece on the table beside the cold lamp. The ticking in her chest wouldn't stop. Downstairs, Mrs. Boone's old clock struck 9. In the silence after came the muffled sound of hooves, steady, measured, fading into the dark. June rose, went to the window, and saw a lone rider pause under the lamplight before turning back toward the open plain. For a moment she thought he looked up, as if he knew she was watching. Then he was gone, swallowed by the quiet. She stood there long after the hoofbeats died, hand resting on the sill, wondering if tomorrow really meant what he said it did. The lamp flickered once and went out, leaving only the sound of wind moving through the cracks of the old house. And somewhere inside that sound, her heart answered, very softly. Volume loud, yes. Morning came thin and sharp over the flats, the kind that smells of dust and horses before the heat sets in. Caleb Reddick waited by the hitching post outside the boarding house, hat in his hands, boots dusted white from the road. When June Whitlow stepped out, her dress brushed with the faintest blue of starch, he nodded instead of speaking. She liked that. No ceremony, no hurry. They walked side by side down Main Street. Shops hadn't opened yet. The windows still caught the pale reflection of the rising sun. A stray dog followed them for a block, then lost interest. June could feel eyes behind the curtains, the whisper of blinds shifting. Townsfolk always watched when a story didn't fit the usual telling. Caleb broke the silence. "You sleep all right?" "Enough to keep walking," she said. "That'll do." His voice had a weight to it, Not heavy, but solid, like a hand laid gently on a shoulder. They reached the small bridge where Cotton Creek curved west, its water clear and slow this time of year. On the far bank, two cottonwood trees grew close together, roots tangled, bark split deep like old scars. He tied his horse to a post and motioned for her to follow the path down. "Them trees been here longer than the town," he said. "My sister used to say they listened to everything, but never judged." He didn't look at her when he said "my sister." His thumb rubbed against the watch fob on his belt, the same pattern of twin leaves carved faint into the leather. "What was her name?" "Etta," he said simply. "She taught me the quiet parts of living. Didn't get much time to use 'em till after she was gone." June watched a leaf spin loose, fall into the creek, and drift under the plank bridge. She thought of the red cloth that had brushed her boot yesterday. She thought of all the things that get carried away before you mean to let them go. They sat for a while on a fallen log. The silence wasn't empty. It was shaped like rest. A hawk cut across the sky. Somewhere behind them, a wagon rattled toward town. "Ever worked a ranch before?" he asked. "No. I worked with ledgers, house accounts, sewing, reading to children." He nodded, thoughtful. "Orderly mind, then. That counts more than muscle some days." She smiled a little. "People don't usually call it that." "They don't usually see straight," he said. The way he said it left no room for reply, but she felt warmth spread under her ribs. She hadn't known she'd missed being spoken to, as if her worth were still intact. They rode later along the fence line, the land opening in long breaths of grass and sage. Caleb pointed out the ridge that marked the boundary of his property. "Twin Cotton sits a mile south. House could use fixing. So could the man in it." His tone carried no self-pity, just truth laid bare. She found herself answering without thinking. "Then we'll fix what can be fixed." He turned in the saddle, one brow raised. "We?" Color rose in her cheeks. "If you meant to find a hand, you'll have one that works. That's all I meant." "That's already more than most offer." They stopped near a stretch of grass where cattle grazed, brown dots moving slow against the pale earth. A wind stirred, carrying the smell of sage and something like rain even though the sky was empty. Caleb dismounted, picked up a fallen horseshoe, and handed it to her. "Keep it. Not for luck. Just a reminder that metal bends easier when you know where the heat goes." She turned it in her hand, the iron cool, the shape imperfect but strong. He mounted again, looking east where the light had started to burn. "I've been told I come late to things," he said, "but I show up when I mean to." She met his eyes. That might be the only kind of timing that matters. The corner of his mouth lifted, a ghost of a smile. "You sound like Etta." The name hung between them for a breath. His sister, her absence, the space grief leaves open for something new to take root. They headed back toward town. The sun was higher now, turning the dust to gold. June rode in silence, holding the horseshoe in her lap, feeling the rhythm of the hooves under her like a heartbeat. She didn't know what tomorrow would ask of her, but for the first time in years, The question didn't feel like a threat. Time 900 mess. When they reached Main Street again, the first shopkeeper lifted a brow at the sight of them. Caleb tipped his hat, unbothered. June caught her reflection faintly in the window. Dust on her hem, hair undone by wind, and thought she almost looked alive again. At the corner, he reined in his horse. "Tomorrow I'll take you to the ranch," he said. "Let you see what a promise looks like when it's still workin'." She nodded. "Tomorrow, then." He touched the brim of his hat, and she caught a glint of light on the worn leather fob. Then he turned south, the shape of him thinning into the brightness. June stood watching until the dust swallowed him whole. The horseshoe felt heavy in her hand. Behind her, somewhere in the shadowed alleys, a man's voice muttered, half pity, half scorn. "He'll learn." She didn't turn to look. The wind rose, carrying the sound away before it could reach her twice. The third morning broke under a pale sky that smelled of hay and iron. June Whitlow rode beside Caleb Reddick, following a trail that curved toward a low ridge. The sound of hooves on hard earth echoed steady, like a pulse that neither hurried nor slowed. They spoke little. Out here, silence felt less like distance and more like breath shared between two lives that didn't yet know what to call each other. When the roof of Twin Cotton Ranch came into view, it looked as though the house had been built from the bones of the land. Timber gray, fences stitched into the wheat fields, smoke rising thin from the cookhouse chimney. A man waited by the corral, broad-shouldered, hat low. "That's Moses Crane," Caleb said. "He's been here longer than anyone, even me." Moses tipped his hat when they rode up. His face was carved deep by sun and wind, but his eyes held the kind of peace that comes only after a long surrender. "You must be Miss Whitlow," he said. "Heard you're the one not afraid of work." June smiled faintly. "Depends on the work." He nodded toward the corral. "Then let's see." Inside, a Palomino mare shifted restlessly, her coat bright as wheat. Moses opened the gate slow, murmuring to the horse in a tone so soft it could have been prayer. "Name's Honeycomb," he said. "She'll test you first." June reached out, careful, letting the mare sniff her fingers before touching the soft place between its eyes. Honeycomb snorted once, then leaned forward, the weight of its head settling against her palm. Moses chuckled. "Guess she likes your kind of quiet." Caleb watched from the fence, arms folded. The sight of her there, small against all that light and dust, did something unexpected inside him. For the first time in a long while, the ranch didn't look like a burden waiting to be carried. It looked like something that might remember joy. After a while, he said, "Let's get out of the sun." They walked to the edge of the pasture, where the cottonwoods threw a little shade. June leaned on the split-rail fence, hands resting on the rough wood. The wind caught her sleeve, pushing it back just enough to reveal the edge of a scar, thin, white, and old. She pulled the fabric down quick, but not before he saw. He said nothing at first, only studied the trees beyond her shoulder. Then softly, "How long ago?" She hesitated. The words came dry. long enough that most people think it never happened. He waited. The silence stretched, but it wasn't cruel. It was space. "I was promised once," she said finally, "to a man who liked his whiskey more than his vows. One night I learned how sharp a belt can sound. I left before morning and never stopped walking." The wind stirred the grass around them. A cloud crossed the sun, dimming the world to silver. Caleb reached into his coat and pulled out a folded square of red cloth. It was old, the edges frayed, the color faded to rust. "My sister used to wear this," he said. "Kept it tied around her wrist when she was scared of thunder. She said red was the color that made the world remember you." He held it out. "If you want it, take it. If you don't, I'll keep it for her." June's throat tightened. She took the cloth, not for its color, but for the steadiness in his eyes. She tied it loosely around her wrist. The fabric was warm from his pocket, smelling faintly of dust and sage. For a while they stood like that, two figures under the cottonwoods, both marked in their own ways, one by what had been done to her, the other by what he'd lost. The afternoon passed in the rhythm of chores. June helped Moses gather feed, learned how to shut the barn doors so the wind wouldn't pull them off their hinges. Caleb mended a fence rail, humming low. The ranch moved as if it had been waiting for her to arrive. As the sun slid west, they sat on the corral fence. The sky turned amber, the light soft as breath. June looked down at the red cloth, catching the glow. "It's strange," she said. "I thought I'd feel smaller here, but I don't." Caleb rested his forearms on his knees. "That's how you know a place might fit you." For a moment, neither spoke. The sound of evening, horses shifting, crickets tuning up, filled the quiet. Somewhere, a bell from the cookhouse rang once, hollow and clear. Caleb rose, brushing dust from his coat. "Tomorrow, I'll show you where I plan to build something new. Could use your eye for how to set it right." "What is it?" He smiled just a little. "You'll see." June watched him walk back toward the barn, the light catching the pale line of his shoulders, and thought she could already feel something uncoiling in her chest. Something slow, not yet hope, but near it. The wind changed, cooler now. She pulled the red cloth tighter around her wrist, felt it settle like a promise she hadn't made but might one day keep. In the distance, thunder murmured beyond the hills. The mare in the corral lifted its head, ears flicking toward the sound. June looked out over the open fields, heart steady, ready for the first drop of rain. The morning broke soft, the kind of light that made even dust look holy. June Whitlow followed Caleb Reddick down a narrow trail that cut behind the barn and wound toward a stretch of open land sloping to the creek. The air smelled of hay and sage. Dew clung to the cuffs of her dress. Caleb carried 2 tin cups and a pot of coffee that steamed in the chill. They stopped by a flat of dry ground beside the water. Caleb poured the coffee, handed her 1 cup, and said, "This here's where I plan to build something." She took a sip, careful, watching the surface ripple in the wind. "A fence?" He shook his head. "A place to sit the young ones down. Get 'em readin'. Folks out here work hard but die dumb. That ain't right. June blinked. She hadn't expected him to say that word reading so plain, so heavy with meaning. You want a school? Not one the county runs, he said. A small room, maybe in the barn at first. Nights after chores. I can get a few lanterns and scrap boards for desks. Just need someone who can keep order. She smiled at that. An ache in her chest that felt both old and new. You think I can? I think you already do, he said, glancing at her wrist, where the red cloth fluttered against the wind. They sat for a while, the coffee cooling between them. Across the creek, a group of children were chasing a calf through the tall grass, laughter carrying over the water. One of them tripped, popped back up, grinning wide with a mouth missing 2 teeth. June watched them, a softness creeping into her eyes. Where I was raised, girls like me weren't allowed to teach. Said we were better fit for tending hearths than books. And what did you believe? He asked. I believed words could build more than walls, she said quietly. He nodded, the hint of a smile. Then we'll build some walls that hold words, not cattle. For the first time since she'd met him, she laughed. It wasn't loud, just a breath escaping after being held too long. Caleb looked up, and for a second, his eyes weren't distant. They were warm, the color of soil after rain. Later, they rode into town for supplies. People stepped aside as they passed. No one spoke, but the silence carried judgment as clearly as any word. June kept her back straight, her hand resting near the saddle horn. Caleb didn't seem to notice the stares, or maybe he'd stopped caring years ago. At the general store, Rafe Collins, a wiry boy of 15, was sweeping the porch. His hands were red with cold, his eyes quick and curious. He straightened when they approached. "Morning, Mr. Reddick," he said. "Need feed again?" "Not today, son. You read?" Rafe blinked, confused. "Some. Letters, mostly." Caleb nodded toward June. "She'll be running a class soon. Come by the ranch when you can spare an evening." The boy's face lit like a struck match. "You mean it?" "I don't say what I don't mean," Caleb answered. As they rode away, June glanced back. Rafe stood on the porch, broom forgotten, staring after them as if the world had just opened another door. Back at the ranch, clouds gathered low, promising rain but never keeping the promise. June worked alongside Moses, sorting old boards, counting nails, marking how many lanterns they'd need. She moved with purpose, her hands quick, her voice firm when giving measurements. At supper, Caleb watched her across the table. The lamplight flickered over her face, softening the angles worn by years of disappointment. "You make plans like you've been waiting to," he said. "Maybe I have," she replied. "Maybe all my running was just to find a place that needed building." He leaned back, thoughtful. "Funny thing about this land. It breaks most who come, but the ones it doesn't, it keeps." June traced the rim of her tin cup, thinking about that. The wind outside moaned through the eaves like a low fiddle. "I'll stay through the storm season," she said finally, "if you'll have me." His answer came slow but sure. Then it settled. For a long time, neither spoke. Outside, the rain began at last. Soft, hesitant drops against the roof, the smell of wet dust drifted in, filling the space between them. When she rose to clear the table, he stopped her with a word. "Tomorrow, come earlier. I want to show you something at the creek." "What is it?" He smiled just enough to keep her wondering. "You'll see." That night, June stood at the window of her small room, the lamplight trembling on the red cloth still tied at her wrist. It had darkened with dust, but she couldn't make herself untie it. Out there beyond the rain, two cottonwoods swayed against the night sky, their branches whispering like voices too far away to name. She pressed her palm to the glass, feeling the cool seep into her skin. The storm had passed, but the air still hummed with something alive, something waiting. Somewhere below, a door closed softly, the sound of someone who kept his word. The seventh day rose cold and clear, the kind of morning that carried silence like a weight. June Whitlow stood by the corral fence, watching steam rise from the horses' backs. The land smelled of frost and wood smoke, and the creek ran thin beneath a sheet of ice. From inside the barn came the steady rasp of a saw, the rhythm of someone who worked to think. Caleb Reddick emerged with his sleeves rolled, sawdust in his hair. He wiped his hands on a rag and looked at her across the yard. "You came early." "You told me to," she answered, trying not to smile. He nodded, set the rag aside. "Then I best not waste your time." They walked toward the two cottonwoods, their shadows stretching long over the frosted ground. Caleb carried something in his coat pocket, a small box made from dark wood. He stopped beneath the trees, the light falling through the bare branches like pale lace. "I've never been one for speeches," he said. "Words feel better when they're earned, not polished." June folded her hands to keep from fidgeting. The red cloth at her wrist stirred in the breeze, the only bright thing in all that winter color. He opened the box. Inside lay a thin silver ring, worn smooth from years of use. "Was my mother's," he said quietly. "She used to tell me, a promise isn't a ribbon, it's a tool. You use it every day, and if you do, it shines." He looked up at her. "I can't promise ease or comfort. I can promise sunrise and work, a place beside me, and a share in whatever this land becomes. I need a partner, not an ornament. I'm asking if you'd be that." The air between them held its breath. June stared at the ring, then at the man who'd placed it there, his face open in that rare way men show only when truth leaves them no armor. "Caleb," her voice caught. "You hardly know me." "I know enough," he said. "You stood still when the rest turned away. You didn't flinch at hard ground. That's knowing plenty." She took a long breath, the cold biting her lungs. "There's something you should know," she said at last. "The doctor back east once told me I might never bear children. It's part of what got me left behind." Caleb's eyes didn't move from hers. He reached into his pocket again, drew out the watch fob, the twin cottonwood leaves engraved faint on the leather. "Then you should know this. When I was 25, a horse threw me. Doctor said the same thing to me, only plainer. The silence that followed was not sorrowful. It was recognition, like two mirrors facing each other and finding mercy in the reflection. June's eyes softened. So we'll build a house with empty rooms? He smiled, slow and sure. Empty's just another word for waiting. Maybe the good Lord's got other ways of filling a home. She looked down at the ring. You mean this? I mean everything that comes after it. The wind bent the branches overhead, scattering a few dry leaves across the ground. June lifted her hand and he slid the ring on her finger. It fit as if the years had been measuring for it all along. For a while neither spoke. The sound of the creek under its thin ice was the only witness. Then Caleb said, There's a gathering at the church tonight. Folks'll talk. Let 'em. I'll be there with you. That evening, the church smelled of oil lamps and pine. Every pew was filled, the hum of voices low but pointed. June stood near the door, her back straight, hands clasped before her. Caleb entered late as he always did, the cold still on his coat. When he reached her, he didn't hesitate. He took her hand in his and kept it there, plain as day. A ripple moved through the room, whispers, a chair scraping, someone's gasp quickly swallowed. Then, one by one, people fell quiet. Caleb's hand was steady, rough against hers. He leaned close, murmured, Sometimes you got to show a promise to make folks believe it. June turned to look at him, the lamplight catching the silver ring between their fingers. She felt the old fear rise, then fall away like ash in wind. Across the aisle, Silas Pratt, the banker, watched them with a thin smile. His eyes followed the ring, then moved to Caleb's face. A bold choice, he said under his breath, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Caleb didn't so much as blink. It's the only kind worth making, the hymn began. Voices uneven but sincere. June's hand stayed in his through the first verse, through the rustle of turning pages, through the quiet that came when the last note faded. When she finally looked up, the faces around her were softer than before, curious maybe, but no longer cruel. Outside, the sky had gone dark and clear. The stars came down low enough to touch the roofs. Caleb helped her onto the wagon seat. As they started home, the wheels creaked over frozen ground, the night wide and full of breath. She looked at him, at the faint light of the lantern bouncing off the curve of his jaw, and said, You came late, Mr. Reddick. He smiled without turning. Always do, but I show up when it counts. The road curved toward the ranch, two shadows side by side against the pale snow. The horse's breath smoked in the cold. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called once, then went quiet, as if even the wild was holding its breath for what tomorrow might bring. The wedding was so small it almost felt like a secret. Caleb Reddick had cleared out the old church hall by hand the night before, sweeping dust from the steps until his shoulders ached. The morning of, frost glittered on the windows like lace. June Whitlow arrived on foot, the hem of her blue dress catching snow. She carried no bouquet, just her gloves and a heart that wouldn't quite settle. Inside, the air smelled of pine resin and lamp oil. Mrs. Hattie Boone stood near the front, wiping her eyes with the corner of her apron. Ellie fussed with June's hair, tucking a single white feather into the braid. Moses Crane waited beside Caleb like an old sentinel, hands folded on his hat. Outside, the wind shifted, low and mean. The preacher cleared his throat. "You ready, son?" Caleb glanced at June. "Been ready longer than I knew." Her laugh trembled. It wasn't fear. It was the feeling of something ending and beginning at once. The vows were simple. Caleb spoke slow, careful, the way he might read a map before crossing unknown land. "I promise the work, the weather, the quiet between storms. I promise to keep the fire lit and the gate closed. I'll call you partner before I call you wife." June's voice came softer. "And I'll meet you halfway on every road. If one of us stumbles, the other waits. That's my word." The preacher nodded. "Then you're wed." No music followed. No applause. Just a long breath from the crowd, and outside the wind picking up around the eaves. Caleb slid the silver ring back onto her finger. It shone like a thread of morning light. Moses pressed a hand to Caleb's shoulder. "You chose right, son." "I think she did too," Caleb said. When they stepped outside, snow had begun to fall, thin flakes drifting through the sunlight, half rain, half ash. June looked up. "First snow," she whispered. "That means the season's turning." Caleb nodded, rate, slow. "Storm's coming. Always does after a day like this." He helped her onto the wagon, then climbed in beside her. The town's main street was nearly empty, but a few faces lingered behind curtained windows. June felt their eyes, but not their laughter. It was as if the sound had finally run out of them. By the time they reached the ranch, clouds had gathered thick over the ridge. Moses was already stacking wood by the porch, and the cattle were restless, lowing at the smell of change. Caleb jumped down, unhitched the horses, and looked toward the horizon. "We'll need to brace the south door," he said. June went to the house, and still smelling faintly of soap and smoke. She set the kettle on, laid out 2 mugs, then drew the curtains tight against the rising wind. It made the window panes shiver like nervous hands. When Caleb came in, snow was already clinging to his coat. "Looks bad," he said. "Bigger than I thought." "How long will it last?" "Long enough to test us." He smiled, but there was tiredness behind it. The kind that comes when you've lived too many winters alone. She reached for his coat sleeve, brushed the snow away. The touch surprised them both. His arm froze for a second, then relaxed. "Go sit," she said. "I'll get the stove going." He obeyed without a word. The storm hit just after dusk, slamming against the walls like something alive. Outside, the barn doors banged, the roof groaned, the world beyond the windows vanished in white. Inside, the fire caught slow, then strong. The room glowed amber, the heat crawling up from the floor. Caleb sat at the table, boots off, shoulders heavy. June ladled stew into 2 bowls. The smell of onions and salt filled the air. They ate in silence, spoons clinking soft against tin. At one point, the wind howled so hard it rattled the dishes. Caleb rose, went to the window, and pressed his hand to the glass. "Never liked the sound," he said. "Storms make a man remember everything he thought he buried." She came to stand beside him, her reflection dim in the glass. "You're not the only one with ghosts, Caleb." "I reckon not." The lamps flickered. Outside, lightning flashed, blue on snow. For an instant, the fields looked endless, white rolling into black. Then darkness swallowed it again. He turned toward her. "If the roof holds and the fire stays, we'll be fine. And if it doesn't, then we'll make it hold." That quiet certainty anchored her more than any promise could. She looked at him, at the lines around his eyes, the steadiness that wasn't pride but endurance, and felt something shift inside her chest, small but sure. Hours later, when the storm had reached its worst, Caleb slumped in his chair, fever rising under his skin. June found him half asleep, shivering though the fire blazed. She touched his forehead. It burned. "Caleb?" He tried to speak, but the words tangled. "Just cold," he muttered. She fetched blankets, tucked them around him, stoked the fire higher. Then she sat close, rubbing warmth into his hands. The red cloth at her wrist brushed his knuckles as she worked. The wind screamed, throwing snow against the shutters. June leaned forward, whispering not prayer but presence. "You're not alone now. Hear me?" His breath slowed, steadied. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, the house held. Toward midnight, she heard a sharp knock, once, twice, at the door, the kind that didn't belong to wind. She froze, eyes darting toward Caleb. He was still asleep, his face pale. Another knock, harder. June stood, heart quickening. The handle trembled, and beyond it, through the storm, a voice she didn't know called her name. The knocking came again, slow, deliberate, muffled by snow. June Whitlow gripped the door handle, pulse quick in her throat. The wind wailed through every crack, the hinges moaning like an old ghost. Behind her, the fire snapped and flared. Caleb Reddick stirred, half waking. "Stay back," she whispered. He tried to rise, but the fever dragged him down again. June pulled the latch. The door flew open a hand's width, and snow burst in like breath from a beast. A man stood outside, wrapped in a heavy coat, scarf pulled to his nose. His eyes gleamed mean in the lamplight. "Evening, Mrs. Reddick," he said. It was Jonas Hale, one of Silas Pratt's men. "Mr. Pratt sent word. He figures your husband's behind on payment for the south pasture. Told me to collect, or make note of what's worth taking." "This is no time," June said, voice steady but low. "He's sick. The storm." Jonas laughed. "Weather don't change debt, ma'am. Man ought not buy more land than he can keep warm." She planted herself between him and the fire. You'll wait till morning. That's all the time I'll give you." He looked her over, smirked. Didn't think the black rancher's new wife had bite. "Try me," she said, and shut the door hard enough to shake loose a drift of snow from the roof. For a long while she stood with her back against the door, breath shallow. Outside, the wind swallowed his fading curse. When she turned, Caleb was awake, his eyes fever bright. "Who was it?" "Just a man with no manners," she said, kneeling beside him. "Rest now." He coughed, shaking his head. "Pratt's behind that. He's been circling this place since the thaw." "Then we'll hold till the thaw comes again," she said, pressing a cool cloth to his temple. He tried to smile. "You sound like you've done this before." "I've had practice standing my ground." The storm roared for 2 more days. Snow piled against the windows, muting the world. June barely slept. She kept the fire alive, melted ice for water, and read aloud from an old almanac just to fill the silence. Time 900. When the fever grew worse, she tore up her underskirt to make bandages, soaked them in vinegar and snowmelt, praying they'd draw the heat out. Once in his delirium, Caleb murmured a name, Etta, and June froze, her hands trembling around the bowl. "She was your sister," she whispered, though he couldn't hear her. "You can let her rest now. You've got someone watching the fire." Toward dawn on the 3rd day, the wind eased. The world outside was nothing but white, a wide, breathless stillness. June opened the door a crack. The snow lay deep as her knees. The trees bowed under it, silvered and still. Somewhere far off, a hawk cried once, thin and lost. She turned to find Caleb asleep, his skin no longer burning. Relief flooded through her so strong she had to lean against the wall. The house smelled of smoke and sweat and something like survival. By noon, she shoveled a path to the barn. Moses Crane was there already, his beard crusted with frost. "Heard the place took a beating." "Still standing," she answered. "That's something." Moses looked toward the ridge. "Riders came through before dawn. Pratt's men. Said they'll be back once the snow clears." June tightened the scarf around her neck. "Then we'll be ready." They spent the afternoon mending doors and feeding the livestock. The world was so quiet, it felt as if the air itself were listening. When Caleb woke later, weak but clear-eyed, June was sitting by the window, sewing. The red cloth at her wrist had faded from crimson to rose. "You kept the house," he said, voice hoarse. "I kept you," she replied. He tried to rise. She helped him sit. "Pratt won't stop," he said. "He thinks this land's still cursed with my name." "Then let's make it blessed," she said simply. That night, after Caleb had fallen asleep again, June heard Ellie Boone's voice calling outside the door. The girl had ridden through the thawing drifts, cheeks raw from cold. "Ma says the town's talking," she said. "Pratt's called a meeting. He says your husband's no rightful owner." June's jaw set. "Did he say when?" "2 days from now. He wants the whole town there." June looked back at the sleeping figure on the bed, then out into the gray horizon. "Tell your mother thank you. And tell Pratt." She paused, breath steady, Tell him I'll bring proof enough to bury his lies. Ellie nodded, wide-eyed. You got proof? Not yet, June said. But I've got to start. She glanced toward the trunk by the wall, the one she'd found in the storage loft weeks earlier, still locked, still heavy. Moses had said it belonged to the man who'd owned the ranch before Caleb, the one Pratt swore died owing him. The padlock was rusted but weak. She fetched a hammer, struck once, twice until it broke clean. Inside were papers, ledgers, and one folded contract stamped with a red seal and Pratt's signature. She traced the ink with her fingertip, heart pounding. The date was older than Caleb's ownership, and the words clear. The undersigned assumes full risk of the herd crossing under frozen conditions. She smiled, a small, sharp thing. So that's what you've been hiding. Snow slid from the roof, crashing into the drift below. The sound echoed like a gunshot. June folded the paper carefully, tucked it into the red cloth at her wrist. She turned toward the sleeping man, the steady rise and fall of his chest, and whispered, "Rest easy. I've got work to do." Outside, the sky had cleared. The stars came back, cold and endless, scattered across the plains like nails waiting to hold a roof against any storm. When the thaw came, it came sudden, like breath returning to a body that had nearly forgotten how to breathe. The ice on Cotton Creek cracked and moaned, then let go. The air turned soft, heavy with the smell of mud and smoke. June Whitlow watched the first trickle of water carve its path toward the plains and thought of what else might break free before the day was done. By afternoon, wagons began to roll into town. Silas Pratt had called for a meeting, and the people of Cinder Creek, hungry for gossip after the long freeze, obeyed. The church bell rang once, its echo drifting over half-thawed snow. Inside the town hall, the stove burned low. Men stomped their boots. Women shook out shawls. June entered last, her hair pinned neat, the red cloth now folded around her wrist like a quiet flame. Caleb Reddick walked beside her, pale but standing, one hand resting on Moses Crane's arm for balance. The murmur that swept the room at their arrival was sharp, brittle, like the ice that hadn't melted yet in people's hearts. Pratt stood near the podium, his suit pressed, smile smooth as oil. "Neighbors," he began, "we gather to discuss a matter of fairness. Land titles, debts unpaid, and the truth of who holds rightful claim to Twin Cotton Ranch." Caleb didn't speak. He simply met the man's gaze. Pratt continued, his tone growing slicker. "Years back, Mr. Reddick took possession under questionable means. Some of you recall, there was an accident that winter. Men lost when a herd was driven across the frozen ford. The one who led them claimed it was my doing, though I was the only man left to shoulder the cost. Now that same hand dares to call this town home." A ripple of discomfort moved through the crowd. The story had been told so many ways, no one remembered which was true. June stepped forward before anyone could answer. "Mr. Pratt," she said, voice calm but cutting, "you speak of fairness. Then let's begin with facts, not rumors." He turned, pretending surprise. "Mrs. Reddick, is it? I wasn't aware the ranch passed into your keeping." "It did the day your man came knocking during a blizzard," Shishun said. "And I told him to come back when the snow stopped. He should have told you I meant more than weather." A few men chuckled. Others shifted uneasily. Pratt's jaw tightened. "This is no place for dramatics." "No," she said, reaching into her coat, "but it is a place for truth." From the pocket, she drew the folded contract she'd found in the old trunk. The red wax seal glimmered faintly in the lamplight. She laid it on the podium. "This is the agreement you signed with the ranch's former owner 2 winters before he died. Your signature, your terms. You ordered the herd to cross on frozen water, despite warnings. You assumed full risk." Gasps rippled through the hall. Pratt's color drained. "That paper's worth nothing," he snapped. "It's ancient." "Maybe so," Moses Crane rumbled from the back. "But I was there when it was signed. Man who held the pen is buried because of it." He stepped forward, his old eyes bright as steel. "You told us he'd run off with the money. Truth is, he froze trying to follow your orders." The room went still. Even the stove seemed to stop breathing. Caleb straightened, his hand steadying on the bench. "You've lived off that lie for near 10 years, Pratt. Took a man's land, his name, and thought no one'd care. But you forgot. Truth's like spring water. It finds its way out." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then one of the miners in the back spoke up. "That true, Pratt?" Pratt's lips parted, but no sound came. The quiet stretched until it felt heavier than the blizzard had. Finally, he hissed. "You think anyone'll take her word over mine? A woman brought in from the church steps by a—" "Say it," Caleb said softly. Pratt looked around, but every face was turned against him now. He swallowed the word, picked up his hat, and pushed through the door into the fading light. The sound of his boots on thawed mud was the only sound left. June exhaled slowly, her fingers trembling. The red cloth at her wrist was damp with sweat. Someone began clapping, hesitant at first, then louder, Moses's. Big hand came down on Caleb's shoulder. "You stood long enough under snow, son. Time the town sees what's left standing." Caleb looked at June, eyes shining with something between relief and awe. "You saved the ranch." She shook her head. "We saved more than that. We saved the name of it." As they stepped out into the street, the thawing world glistened around them. Water ran off the roofs in silver threads. A few children splashed in puddles, shouting laughter into the new air. June paused beside the wagon, her breath fogging. "He'll come back," Caleb said quietly. "I know," she replied. "Then we'll meet him with more than words next time." "What do you mean?" "I mean a light," she said, looking toward the horizon. "A place people can see from miles out. A place that teaches truth before lies ever take root again." He followed her gaze to the empty barn, its roof shining wet. "The school." She nodded. "We start at sundown." That evening, as the first stars rose over the wet fields, June hung a lantern in the barn window. The flame trembled, then steadied, throwing a long stripe of gold across the mud. It wasn't much, but it was enough for a beginning. From the ridge, someone watched. The shadow of a man on horseback, the wind tugging his coat. Pratt's voice carried faintly down the slope. "Enjoy your victory, Mrs. Reddick. We're not done." June turned from the door, her voice low but sure. "Then come to class, Mr. Pratt. You've still got something to learn." The barn smelled of sawdust, oil, and hope. June Whitlow Reddick lit the last of the lamps, their wicks trembling in the night air. The glow threw soft halos on the rough wood walls, catching motes of dust that drifted like golden snow. Outside, the wind was gentle, carrying the thaw's damp sweetness from the creek. Inside, a handful of people sat on benches made from old feed crates. Men and women who had spent years bent over earth or iron, now straightening themselves before a row of chalkboards. At the front stood Caleb Reddick, leaning on a cane Moses had whittled from cottonwood. He looked out over the faces, tired, wary, but lit from within by curiosity. Then his gaze settled on June. She nodded once. "All right," she said, her voice soft but sure. "We'll start with names." The murmur quieted. A few glanced at each other, unsure. June picked up a piece of chalk, wrote her name across the top of the board. June. Every word starts here, with a name. Not the one someone gives you, but the one you claim. She turned. "Who's first?" A boy of 15 raised his hand. Rafe Collins, the same one from the store porch weeks ago. His shirt was patched, his fingers stained with coal dust. "Ma never taught me letters proper," he said. "That's why you're here," she replied. "Come on." He walked up, shoulders stiff with embarrassment. June guided his hand, steady as a mother's. Together they traced each letter. R, A, F, E. When the chalk scraped to its end, he stepped back, staring as if it were a sunrise written just for him. Caleb's throat tightened. The boy grinned. "Feels like I just made myself real." "You did," June said. Moses clapped once, the sound deep as thunder. "Next." A woman followed. A miner's wife named Cora May. Then 2 Mexican, farmhands who could speak but not read English. One by one they wrote the first letters of their names, laughter mingling with the smell of lamp oil and chalk. Each word felt like a small fire catching. In the back corner, a thin little girl hid beneath a desk, clutching a ragged doll. June crouched down beside her. "Hello, sweetheart. What's your name?" The girl shook her head, eyes wide. Ellie Boone, helping at the door, whispered, "That's Ivy. Or that's what we call her. She don't talk much since her folks passed." June smiled gently. "That's all right. You can listen till you're ready." She placed a stub of chalk on the girl's desk. "You don't have to write yet. Just hold it. Chalk remembers hands." For the rest of the lesson, Ivy didn't move, but her fingers curled tight around that small white stick. Later, when the group finished their first sentences, crooked and proud, Caleb carried a bucket of water outside and stood by the door. From the hill above, the light spilling from the barn windows looked like a heartbeat in the dark. "Did you ever think you'd see this?" June asked, stepping beside him. He shook his head slowly. "Never thought I'd want to." They stood together, listening to the murmur of voices inside, the sound of people discovering themselves, letter by letter. Then a sudden draft blew through the door. The lamps flickered, and one went out, plunging half the barn into shadow. "I'll fix it," Moses said, grabbing his hat. But before he reached the door, a noise rose outside, the crunch of boots on gravel, slow and deliberate. June felt the air change. She looked toward the dark field beyond the fence, saw a faint lantern swing once, twice, then vanish. Her hand went instinctively to her wrist, tightening around the red cloth. Caleb straightened, his cane firm against the ground. "Stay here," he said quietly. "Caleb, I won't start another war," he murmured. "But I'll end, the one that comes." He stepped outside into the dark. The wind pressed against his coat, carrying faint laughter. Men's voices retreating toward the ridge. When he came back in, his jaw was set. "Pratt's dogs," he said. "Just watching. Let 'em watch. Maybe they'll learn something." June met his eyes, unafraid. "We'll keep teaching." He nodded. "Till there's nothing left for them to fear." The lamps were relit. The lesson continued. But for the rest of the night, June couldn't shake the image of that swinging lantern fading into the dark, like a warning left unfinished. When the last of the students filed out, Ivy lingered. She climbed onto a stool, chalk in hand, and scratched something on the board. The letters were wobbly, uneven, but clear. Ivy. She looked at June, then at the doll in her arms, and whispered, "It remembers." June's eyes stung. She reached out, touched the girl's shoulder. "Yes, darling, it does." Outside, the stars blinked through thin clouds. The air was cold but alive, full of promise and breath. June turned down the lamps one by one, leaving only the middle one burning, a single gold heart in the dark. As she stepped outside, the light followed her onto the frost-slick ground, stretching long toward the horizon. Somewhere in the hills, an unseen rider paused, watching that glow, and then slowly turned away. The morning after the first class, light came soft and gold, spilling over the plains like honey. The snow was gone now, replaced by damp earth and shoots of green. June Whitlow. Reddick stood on the porch, breathing the air that smelled of cedar and thawed soil. In her hands was a letter from the post rider, a torn envelope carrying news she hadn't expected. An old acquaintance from back east had read of their night school in a traveling gazette and sent a small donation, enough for books and nails. She read the words twice before folding them close to her heart. "We're not alone anymore," she murmured. Down by the barn, Caleb Reddick and Moses Crane were already at work. The sound of hammer on wood carried clean through the still air, steady, rhythmic, purposeful. Caleb's cane leaned against a fence post while he guided a saw with his good hand. His breath came heavy, but his face was alive in a way June hadn't seen before. She walked down to them, skirts brushing wet grass. "You'll wear yourself out," she said. He smiled without looking up. "Can't build a roof by resting." "What roof?" He nodded toward the creek, where the ground rose slightly before dipping into a shallow bend. "That's where the schoolhouse goes," he said. "High enough not to flood, close enough the kids can hear the water." June followed his gaze. "It's beautiful." "Not yet," Moses said, setting down a plank. "But it will be, if we can keep the thieves off our trail." June understood. Pratt's men still haunted the edges of their land, unseen but felt. "Then we'll build it faster," she said simply. The town began to help. Hattie Boone sent sacks of flour and jars of preserves for whoever swings a hammer. Ellie gathered bottles to turn into inkwells, even. The quiet families from the outskirts, Mexican, Irish, and Black, brought scraps of lumber, bent nails, and bare hands. Rafe worked like a man twice his age, hauling boards and quoting words he'd just learned to read. Ivy sat on the grass with her doll, humming, passing nails like they were coins of gold. Every evening, the sun dipped behind the ridge and left a copper glow across the half-built walls. June's laughter began to mix with the ring of hammers. For a while it seemed that even the land had decided to listen. One night, she found Caleb standing by the creek, watching the half-framed roof catch starlight. His hands were raw, his shirt torn, but his eyes were calm. "You ever think we'd come to this?" she asked. He shook his head. "Didn't think I'd live to see the ground grow something worth keeping." She stepped beside him. "You already did. You just had to call it by the right name." He glanced at her wrist. The red cloth faded now to the color of old wine. "Still wearing that?" "I will till it falls apart," she said. "It remembers where I started." A coyote barked somewhere up the ridge, sharp and lonely. Caleb's gaze stayed on the schoolhouse frame. "Pratt won't let it be," he said finally. "He'll try to make this fail." June's voice was quiet, steady. "Then he'll have to fight more than just us." "What do you mean?" She looked toward the barn, where Rafe and Moses worked under a lantern. "I mean, he'll have to fight the kind of people who've learned to spell their own names." For the first time, Caleb laughed, low and rough, but real. "Then we're already winning." The next morning, the sound of wagon wheels woke them early. A load of boards and books had arrived, gifts from the neighboring homesteads. Children followed the wagon, shouting, "The teacher's books! The teacher's books!" June climbed up to help unload. Her hands smelled of pine and paper dust. She found an old slate among the bundles and traced her fingertip over its smooth surface. It felt like promise. By midday, the roof was done, and the walls stood straight. Caleb leaned against the door frame, breathing hard but smiling. "Looks like it belongs here," he said. "It does," June replied. "Everything worth staying for does." That night, she couldn't sleep. She walked out to the half-finished schoolhouse, lantern in hand. The creek whispered nearby and frogs sang low in the reeds. Inside the skeleton of the building, she saw Ivy, curled up on a blanket, fast asleep with her doll tucked beneath her chin. The girl had wandered there alone and drifted off, safe under those new beams. June knelt beside her, brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. The child's lips moved in dream speech. "Don't let the light go." "I won't," June whispered back. She sat there until dawn, the lantern between them burning steady. When the first light touched the horizon, Ivy stirred, eyes blinking open. "Morning?" she asked, voice small. "Morning," June said. "And it's yours." Years passed quietly across the plains, soft as wind through wheat. The schoolhouse by the creek stood white and solid now, laughter spilling from its open windows. Inside, the desks shone smooth from small hands, and above the chalkboard someone had written in careful letters, "Names are how we stay." Rafe Collins, no longer a boy, taught the morning class. His voice carried strong and kind, the same tone Caleb once used on the range. Ivy, grown tall and sure, passed out slates, her braids tied with red ribbons. Outside, under the cottonwood trees, June Whitlow Reddick and Caleb Reddick sat on the porch, watching the world they'd built take root. June's hair had turned silver at the edges. The red cloth still circled her wrist, faded to a gentle pink. Caleb carved a small horse from cedar, his hands slow but steady. They didn't talk much. After years of storms, words had become less necessary. Rafe came out during recess, wiping chalk from his palms. "They're learning quicker than I ever did," he said. Caleb smiled. "Means the world's turning right." The young man laughed, tipping his hat before heading toward the creek with his students. June watched them go, the sun catching in the water, the same shimmer she'd seen that first day she chose to trust. Ivy lingered by the doorway, broom in hand. "The trees sound different lately," she said. June looked up at the cottonwoods, tall and full, their leaves whispering in the wind. "They remember," she said softly. "That's what growing does. It remembers." A soft rain began to fall, warm and light. June and Caleb didn't move. They'd long stopped running from weather. The children huddled inside, their voices echoing with laughter and poems. Through the open window, Rafe's voice called words of thanks and belonging. The sound wrapped around the house like a hymn. Caleb leaned closer. "You ever think we'd end up here?" She smiled. "No, but maybe we were always riding this way." He nodded, eyes drifting toward the trees. "Tomorrow, we plant another row." "For who?" "For whoever's next," he said. "For the names not written yet." The rain deepened to a hush. Beyond the schoolhouse, the land breathed, green, living, full. June reached for his hand, their fingers fitting like they had that first day at the depot, years and lifetimes ago. The red cloth between them caught a drop of rain, darkening like a heartbeat. In the distance, children shouted beneath the storm, laughing at thunder. The cottonwoods swayed, their branches sweeping low, as if blessing every sound. June closed her eyes, listening. "It's still growing," she whispered. Caleb smiled. "So are we." The wind moved through the leaves, soft and endless, carrying their names into tomorrow. And that's where our story settles, under the wide cottonwood sky. a tale of two people who found love not in youth or perfection, but in kindness, work, and quiet understanding. Caleb and June remind us that even the roughest years can grow soft again if we keep showing up, if we keep holding the hands that hold us steady. If this story touched something in you, maybe a memory, maybe a wish, I'd love to hear it. Tell me in the comments what part of June and Caleb's journey stayed with you most. Your words mean more than you think. They're part of what keeps these stories alive. And if you'd like to travel with us again across the old western plains, where hearts heal slow and hope rides beside the sunset, please tap the like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you'll never miss the next story waiting down the trail. Thank you for listening, for feeling, and for remembering that it's never too late to begin again. Until next time, may your evenings be peaceful, your coffee warm, and your heart wide open, like the West itself.